If there is no more requests from the floor, I will now ask Richard DENMAN to try to draw up some preliminary conclusions or to make a short summary in view of the preparation of the summary report of the forum itself on the topic of this first panel. Please, Richard.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Pedro, and hello to everybody. I certainly have found that a very rich and rewarding discussion, and I'd like to congratulate Pedro for keeping us so very much to time and enabling such a lot of points to be made from the floor. That, of course, makes my job a little bit more difficult because you've all said so much. So I've just noted down really what I think are the key points coming out of this. First of all, I think we've had some fantastic illustrations and points made about what a special place Europe is and how very, very precious our natural and cultural heritage is. And we've had various illustrations of that from the speakers and from the interventions. I think we would be tempted to say we're the best in the world as far as natural and certainly cultural heritage is concerned, but we've had comments to say that, you know, we have to be aware of our position in relation to other continents which have very strong heritage sites. The second point I think to make is that clearly the pressures on our precious resource are increasing. Those pressures are coming from outside of tourism, and thereby affecting the ability of tourism to benefit from those special resources. But those pressures are also coming from tourism itself. They're coming from visitors, and they're particularly coming from development. And we had some cautionary notes from Professor Barucci at the very beginning about those pressures. The third point I think to make is to underline the importance of partnership. We're going to hear, of course, a lot about that during the course of today, but this has been particularly underlined in this debate. And we've talked about partnership at a number of different levels. We've first of all talked about the need for proper cooperation between the public sector agencies at a national level and at a local level, and between national and local, a point very much underlined by Anne Vorsch in her presentation. We have particularly heard, though, about the need for engagement of the private sector. They very much have to be partners in the conservation of natural and cultural heritage. What I think came through very strongly to me in that regard is a number of speakers underlined the fact that the private sector are perhaps looking for a framework from the public sector in which they can work and cooperate. And that, I think, is a slightly new line on this, and one I think that bears a lot of further consideration, and I was really quite encouraged by that. And then we were talking a little bit about the community, and we had a comment, you know, to what extent can the local community also be included as partners? And I think we all felt, yes, that's very important, but a few comments to say, well, that can be quite hard. Rather an interesting point from Anne to say that the community is often quite dynamic, and it can be people who've been away from the community who then come back as local residents who are most responsive to the sustainable tourism issues in that community. So it's very important not to look at the community as a sort of static entity. And I think that point came through rather interestingly in the debate. So partnership, yes, and partnership at those different levels. But then a number of interventions about, you know, what are the absolute key needs for the protection of nature and culture in the context of sustainable tourism, and an intervention to say that perhaps there are three. We need very strong legal protection. We need excellent management plans, and we need to have sufficient financial resources. And even on the first one, when we were talking about legal protection, there was some cautionary notes, particularly from here in Portugal, to say that there has been a lot of encroachment on the protected areas here. Are they actually properly protected Do we need to go back to those base principles? And then when it came to management plans, Anne Vorsch said, often the problem in protected areas is not necessarily about the growth in visitors, but it is about poor management. And she particularly said, to do good management now, you need to have multiple skills in the protected areas in the way that we didn't have before. Then I've picked up a number of rather more specific points in the interventions, a number of technical things that I think we need to take on board. The first one was to do with the impact of certain EU rules and regulations and so on small enterprises, and a comment that maybe this is actually detrimental to their ability sometimes to protect the heritage and the environment, and particularly in the concept and context of standardization. And often our rules are meaning that people are not able to be creative in the use of the natural environment, in the protection of the natural environment, particularly as far as the private sector is concerned. We need to guard against standardization. An interesting technical point that looking at things like standardization and the impact of labels, for example, that some of the eco-labels in Europe are not actually recognizing the issue of heritage. They may be all about water and energy conservation and so on. But, for example, the EU flower itself, we were told, does not actually have heritage criteria in its criteria. And this may be not therefore being used effectively as it should be as a tool against standardization. We had somebody say that maybe we need to have more manuals to help protected areas understand how they can engage in sustainable tourism more and protect their sites. And we had a number of comments saying that we need more financial support. There was a lot of praise for the work of the LEADER program in supporting a number of initiatives in rural areas. Somebody said, do we need more dedicated funds to support conservation through tourism? So there's definitely a funding issue there. We had some examples of how the tourism product is being diversified to embrace natural and cultural heritage and impacts on natural sites and so on. Interesting intervention, particularly from our colleague from Lithuania, about some of their creative approaches there in the development of cycle tourism and so on and so forth. So that's certainly one form of response. And then an interesting technical discussion at the end about the relationship between the European Union and IUCN, which was then broadened to say that we have to be more aware in Europe and in the EU particularly about our global responsibilities. And that might have not been as strong as it should have been, certainly in the past. Maybe we're catching up now, but we have got a responsibility, particularly in relation to conservation goals, global conservation goals, the halting the loss of biodiversity, our commitments to the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, and what we have to meet there. And this will require DG Enterprise and DG Environment, and indeed other stakeholders, working more closely together to deliver those commitments. And that work at that very high level should filter right down to strengthening the requirement for better protection in the protected areas here in Portugal and elsewhere as well. We need to see those linkages made right through. And my final point, ladies and gentlemen, is really to echo what one of the speakers said, that really what we're talking about here is a combination of three things. It's a combination of responsibility, integrity, and commitment. And I would like to say how particularly heartened I was that that comment came from a private sector operator here. So thank you very much indeed for that, and it's been a very rich debate.